days not been bad in the first place. And so there's a family named the Bruce family in California. You might have heard of this story where in the 1920s, 1920, they lost their land and the government took it over. There was a black family that was providing a place for black families to do vacation on the California coastline. So they lost their land, and then if you might have read a story recently in 2020, they got their land back after 100 years. They got their land back, now worth $20 million, matter of fact. And so it's like, hooray, hooray. Thank goodness they got their land back. There's some sense of justice there, which is true. However, there was another family that was doing something very similar during the same time in the same similar type of area, and their last name is Hilton. And so it's not just what was lost, it's also what could have been that we'll never know about as well. And so when I talk about reparations, I want to ultimately come to the conclusion for everybody that reparations should ultimately be something that's normalized, that is not something should be polarized at all, not something that's on the fringes, not something that should be politicized even. That is a very biblical, faith-based thing about justice. I hope we all believe that God is a God of justice. Matter of fact, when my CCDA conferences, they say that if you take out all the scriptures of justice in the Bible, you have a tattered and torn Bible. And there's nothing mentioned more often in the Bible than justice other than idolatry. So God is a God of justice, and reparations is all about justice. It's not about charity. It's not about handouts. It's not about doing black people favors. It's about justice. And I want to kind of give you some information to kind of just kind of emphasize that reality. And I'll start off little bit of history going way back into how, because this is a faith group. So I want to kind of something I learned not too many years ago that the church at the time, 1452, in the year 1452 exactly, was when the church actually gave a permission slip to the King of Portugal called the Dum Diversas. It's the papal decree by Pope Nicholas V. And basically what it said, along with some other decrees that came later, was if you want to Christianize people, you have full rights and privileges to do whatever you need to do to people in order to Christianize them. That included taking away their land, it included subjugating them, it included anything you wanted to do in the name of Christianity. And of course, it wasn't long before this was actually just a farce to justify the slave trade, because interestingly enough, the Kingdom of Congo got the hint and they became a Christian nation. The king changed his name to a Christian name and they became a Christian nation. But ultimately, they still end up becoming enslaved from the slave traders. So we know it wasn't really about that. It was about this permission slip to enact something that really was an economic windfall for people and justifying it. And it actually came through a permission slip through the church itself. And I think the church has a role from back then to all the way to now to play in trying to rectify that. I can go on and on about the history and different things that have happened with African Americans over the years to justify reparations. But one thing that is really salient that I think really hits home for people is this idea of how the United States became the wealthiest country in the world. And if you think about it, most people will never dispute that the United States is indeed the wealthiest country on the planet. We have a $30.5 trillion budget compared to China's $19.2 trillion. I think 30.5 trillion dollars for us, 19.2 for China. Distant third is Germany at $4.55 trillion dollars. Assets are tremendously more than any other country in the world. And so no one argues or disputes the fact that, United States has the money. What often people don't think about is how did that happen? I mean, how did this country that is relatively young, right? 1776, the country was born, compared to countries that have been around for thousands of years. How did the United States zoom from zero to two in what ultimately was about 84 years when it became a country in 1776, got on the map as a country to 1860. By 1860, the United States was the second largest economy on the planet, only behind Great Britain. And even a lot of Great Britain's economy was based on the United States. So how did that happen? Well, as we know, there was this thing called slavery. And if you think about it this way, if I had a grocery store and my competitor had a grocery store down the street and I paid my employees, my competitor down the street did not pay their employees, use slave labor to work at the grocery store. Because of the cost savings of my competitor, which would be, 65% of your cost as a business owner is usually your labor. So if you don't have to pay that 65% labor cost, my competitor is going to be able to charge tremendously lower prices than I can charge and still make money. And this is what the United States was able to do in the world. They were able to produce, sell, and deliver cotton cheaper than anybody else, and they had a corner on the market to a point where by 1860, 53% of the money that the United States was bringing in as a country, though, think about your paycheck, 53% of your money's come from this one source, came from the cotton trade alone, let alone other things like tobacco and other ways that the slave trade enhanced the wealth of the United States. So the United States is actually built financially, literally on the backs of African Americans. And this history of slavery has allowed the United States to become this wealthiest nation in the world. And you think about, well, what's tied to being the wealthiest nation in the world? Well, all the privileges people have, the opportunities people have, for those who come to this country for opportunity, how did opportunity get there in the first place? Because of this history of enslavement. So this is one of the things I try to express to people why once you start digging into this research and digging into do some homework in this, and if you have just a little bit of ounce of justice in your heart, the question doesn't become should we do reparations on that is how can we do it? Like how many things, how much can we do? My thing is the most that can be done is the least that should be done. And it becomes like, well, reparations, of course, as opposed to, I don't know about that reparations thing. And so there's a lasting legacy. So we know that this country was built, positively toward the wealth from the backs of African Americans. And then at the same time, you have all those things I mentioned earlier with all the oppression that African Americans had to endure back then and in current up to current day still. And there's a saturation of uh, this kind of culture that this was just kind of okay. You had the land acknowledgement, how oftentimes we don't think about the fact that other people used to occupy this land, and we should be conscientious of that. And we should be, and I'm expressing the same thing when it comes to African Americans in terms of the labor that it took to make this country what it is, being conscientious of that the same way we're conscientious of the fact that we're on land that other people occupied. And again, and it carries on to this day. My daughter works in the Clarksville, Mississippi with a program called Spring to help young people with schooling and things of that nature. And she lives like in the poorest part of Mississippi, which is the poorest state in the country, where in some places the life expectancy for a black man is 60 years old, not even getting to retirement age. And so there's a legacy. It's not just history. It's a legacy of that history that has effect on many, many things today. And when you think about the environmental justice aspect of it, what I found is that any aspect of life you can think of, there's been oppression, discrimination, for African Americans in it. The environment is definitely no different. The EPA, for example, funded a study that found that African Americans breathe more fine particulate matter than white populations across regions and income levels. And this holds true even when you control for income and geography. Black people inhale 1.5 times more air pollution than white people. People of color are 4 times more likely to live near hazardous industrial facilities. And so these outcome of these cancer rates and these other kind of things, earlier mortality rates and what have you, all are legacy effects of this discrimination and this oppression. And this is another example. This is obviously South Carolina. And if you look at the map, these X's and these circles, and you're probably familiar with these are pollutant sources. And the lighter the color, the more African American that part of the state is. So you particularly see in this north eastern part of South Carolina here, where it's very black centered in terms of population. And you see so many of the pollution sites being located in that area. And that's not the only place, it's all around the country. Other examples is Cancer Alley that I'm sure you heard of in Louisiana. As a professor adjunct at Tulane, I had a student that did a study on that and looked at the cancer rates for African Americans in that area. Port Arthur, Texas, predominantly black communities near multiple oil refineries. Black people in general tend to have higher exposure to nitrogen dioxide due to living near highways. Even when you control for income and education, that still boards out to be true. Um, and just nationally, African Americans are 50%, 56% exposed more to pollution than they produce, while white Americans are exposed to 17% pollution, less pollution than they produce. So, in other words, white people are producing more pollution and absorbing less of it, while black people are producing less of it and absorbing more of the pollution. And so, again, disparities exist across all facets of life. The environment is definitely no different than that. And then last statistic I'll share, a 2018 study found that 38.1% of Black respondents in the study live within 1 mile of polluting industrial facility compared to 28.4% of white respondents there. All right. So with all that said, again, why I gave the answer about why reparations, but what are reparations? And this is the UN, the United Nations definition of reparations. It's cessation, restitution, repatriation, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation. I won't get into a whole lot of details on each of those because I only had a limited amount of time. But these are ideas that cessation, you have to stop the oppression. You have to stop doing the harm. And in the Bible, we read about the scripture about Jesus turning the other cheek. It's kind of hard to tell the turn the other cheek when people keep slapping you, right? And so you have to stop the harm. Then there's restitution, making things right. There's compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation. And I like to try to break it down into two major concepts. One is that when you do somebody wrong, you apologize, right? Not a foreign concept, not something we all should be familiar with by this time in our lives. If you do something wrong to someone, you apologize. That's the first part of it, an acknowledgement that you've done something wrong to someone. The second part is when you do something wrong to someone that deserves compensation, you compensate that person. And again, not a thing that we're unfamiliar with. And I drive to Chicago and I look at the highway billboards, half of them are attorneys saying, "Hey, you've been injured? Give me a call, I'll get you some money." If you went to the hospital and they're supposed to operate on the left leg and end up operating on the right leg instead, you usually get some kind of compensation for that. The example I like to use oftentimes is if I was a young man at the age of 20 years old and I got arrested for something I didn't do. And I spent 30 years of my life in jail for a false conviction, something that is not unfamiliar for African Americans, unfortunately. Just in Chicago, there was over 100 or so African American men that was falsely imprisoned just by one police officer. And you can look up that story in of itself. So this is not an unfamiliar story. So I spent 30 years of my life in prison when I shouldn't be. Well, when I finally get exonerated, DNA proves that I never did in the first place. I get out of prison, I deserve some type of compensation. Now, I would say that whatever compensation I get would not be able to make up for my 30 years of lost life. I wouldn't have my family, my kids, my grandkids, none of that stuff will ever happen. I wouldn't be able to start the health center. I wouldn't have done the things that I've done. $2 million wouldn't do the job. But I want the $2 million. Dollars. It's better than having $0 coming out of prison after 30 years. So when people ask questions like, well, if we can't do this big thing with reparations, is it worth doing at all? The answer is yes. I believe that reparations can be done in many different ways. We're only limited with reparations to how it can be done to our own creativity. Some people also say, well, doesn't it matter how people spend the money? Well, if I spend my time in prison unfairly and I get my $2 million, it'd be nice if I spent my $2 million wisely, but that's not the point, right? The point is that it's justice. A little token of justice is justice, and it doesn't matter how I spend it. That's not the point. Another aspect of people typically try to have is where the money going to come from. Well, again, this is sadly, a common story in places like Chicago and other places around the country. And there's a fund, that they pull out of taxpayer base when they have to make settlements for things like this. And I have yet to find one person ever say that when someone's been, X number of years in jail, falsely in prison. I never heard anyone say where we're going to get the money from. They just get the money because they understand that they deserve to get some compensation for what was done to them. And so then that's just the tip of the iceberg, but those are just some of the things I want to kind of address there. Some examples too, and there's another thing, reparations is not new and it has been done for a long time and has been done to other groups for other groups in the past. We might be familiar with Japanese Americans and time in World War II internment camps, how they got reparations. And again, it took about 40 more years for Ronald Reagan to approve the reparations in the 80s, but they got reparations. There are groups of Native Americans who have gotten reparations. Our website for the Champaign-Urbana Reparations Coalition, we have an article that shows like all the different examples of reparations throughout the years, and there's a number of examples of Native Americans getting reparations. Jewish victims of the Nazi persecution got reparations. I went to a lecture by a guy named Hurley Beckles. He's a professor from Barbados. And he goes around the world to talk about reparations. And one day he ran across this woman, a Jewish woman who was in her 80s. And she asked him, "Do you want to see a reparations check?" And he was like, "Sure, I've never seen one before." And so she actually showed him a reparations check. She was still getting reparations from the fact that her parents had died in the Holocaust. And to this day, Germany still pays out reparations for things like that. And what's also interesting about that particular notion is that people try to say, well, I had nothing to do with slavery and all that kind of stuff. Why should I pay reparations? Well, I have a black colleague that lives in Germany, and he works in Germany and he pays taxes in Germany. And guess where some of his tax dollars go to? To Jewish Holocaust victims that are getting reparations. So if you live in a country that a country has a history of doing wrong, by default, you're part of that trying to have that solution. And then the coup de grace, former people who enslaved others got reparations for losing their enslaved people. When Abraham Lincoln had the Emancipation Proclamation and all these other kind of things happened with in the slavery in the North, there are some slave owners who actually got compensation for losing their property, and it was literally called reparations. And so, again, the idea that reparations is has not been done before, anything like that, is a pretty far-fetched idea, and it's been around forever. As I mentioned earlier, you can say the Bible had the first example of reparations. People don't talk about this very often. As a matter of fact, my pastor Renee Antrosio noticed that some not liturgies, but I'm forgetting the name, but there's the lessons that you can pick up from that have like every day of the week of the year, you got that lesson. There's actually some of these commentaries or lessons plans that literally leave out these scriptures on reparations in the Bible, interestingly enough. And one passage, for example, the translation says the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so that they plundered the Egyptians. I think I say a lot of times that people are worried about reparations because they're worried about being plundered like the Egyptians. So why again is this important? I think one of the ways we could think about this is it's not just a matter of getting Black people money and checks. It's a matter of changing the culture and changing the saturation that we have of these mentalities. And I give you an example of how this can be harmful for everybody. This kind of unabated racism has made an effect when it comes to our healthcare. I'm a healthcare person. My doctor is in community health, specialization in health policy. And when it comes to Medicaid, what a lot of people don't realize is that while 26% of people who had used regular Medicaid, not expanded Medicaid, but regular Medicaid, are working age adults. Working age adults only consume or take up about 12% of the actual Medicaid dollars. The other three groups who consume the other 88% of Medicaid dollars include children, people with disabilities, and the elderly who are dual eligible for Medicare and Medicaid. So 88% of the money for Medicaid is spent towards vulnerable populations. Now, if you look at the recent cuts to Medicaid, you're cutting those three main groups: children, people with disabilities, and the elderly. And reason why they kind of told on themselves in terms of the underlying, I believe, racial injustice in this is that they also are forcing a work requirement. So what is the mindset? The people on Medicaid, i.e. welfare, are basically abusing the system. They're not willing to work. They're lazy. They could work and get jobs and get health care, but they refuse to do so. So we're going to put a work requirement or a volunteer requirement on Medicaid for you to get your Medicaid. But here the facts beyond where we actually spend Medicaid on. The other reality is that there are more white people on Medicaid than Black people, just by sheer population. Yeah, proportionally speaking, there's more Black people, but overall, there's more white people Medicaid. So you think about the main population that are using in the dollars of Medicaid, you're talking about, elderly white people and so on and so forth. So these cuts are primarily hurting more white people than they're hurting Black people, even though the undergirding reason for the cuts tend to be this idea of this racial stereotype of people not willing to work. Again, just one example. I like to quote this King quote: says, "It is cruel just to say to a bootless man that he should lift himself by his own bootstraps. It is even worse to tell a man to lift himself by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on the boot." Again, these ideologies are more present than we ever could realize. One quick example I share is that my older brother and I, we loved growing up, we loved the Dukes of Hazzard. We love this show where they're driving in the General Lee car with a Confederate flag on it with the theme song, The Good Old Boys. And two little Black kids are, loving this show. And we weren't the only ones. It was the second most popular show in the 70s and 80s behind Dynasty or Dallas or something. So we weren't the only ones that loved the show. But yeah, here's this show that was being romanticizing and celebrating the Confederate South, a Confederate South that if they had it their way, my brother and I would still be in chains to this day. We'd still be tortured and worked to death and sold off and so on and so forth if they had it their way. I remember reading a quote from someone in one of the books I read, and they were quoting somebody in 1850, and he was projecting how many slaves exist by 1930. It's like, oh yeah, we'll have like 32 million slaves or wherever it was by 1930. I mean, they had plans that this was going to be an ongoing thing. They weren't going to end slavery. And yet, here are we glorifying this show that was directly wanting to slavery continue in perpetuity. So we have to think differently when it comes to this idea of reparations, both in terms of the reason why we don't do it or we don't want to do it, don't think it can be done, to actually looking at different ways where it can be done. It's again, it's more than a financial investment. It's also policy changes on both the individual, local, organizational level, all the way up to the national level. It's legislative changes, and I could go down a list of different things. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Our church, New Covenant Fellowship. They asked me to, after the George Floyd, they signed an anti-racism pact and said that said that we're going to be anti-racist. And what the pact says that you can't just say you're going to be anti-racist, you actually have to do something. And so they asked me to chair their church reparations group. And as we did that, we started to formulate a way to do reparations within our church. What ultimately was decided is that the church was going to provide reparations to descendants of African Americans. It's a predominantly white church. So descendants of African Americans, their kids and grandkids would get education funds. My two grandkids are two examples of this. They started off with $1,000, and then every year they add 500 more dollars to it. And so by the time they turn 18 or time to go to college or to school, they have some kind of fund that they can work with. Again, just one church with one example that what they decide to do and how to do it. Again, there's unlimited potential about what we can do. Um, Another example in Urbana, they did a study that they spent a couple $100,000 on to find out how policing was going in Urbana. And what they discovered was that Black people were getting stopped twice as often as white people. Among those who were being stopped, Black people were searched twice as often as white people. And then among those who were searched, ironically, white people had incriminating stuff on them more often than Black people did. So you spend all this money on this research to find out that, surprise, there's these disparities in traffic stops. Well, how about let's have a fund at the courthouse, the African Americans who are they're in traffic court all the time to be able to utilize this money to pay for their fees, to pay for their court fees, pay for their fines, so that these things don't stop them from being productive and doing what they have to do, losing their jobs and so on and so forth. Again, tiny examples. Ultimately, I would love to see a reparations like AARP or AAA or something like that. But don't get me started. I can go on and on for that. Um, so again, we have to think about what are solutions and solutions with racial justice in mind. So I would encourage you as you continue to do this wonderful mission of moving forward with being good stewards of our environment to also keep in mind how are these things been done unfairly, but also what does justice look like? I was recently it really hit me when I went to one of our symposiums for reparations and someone said, you know what, if we really did have racial justice and reparations, what would our society look like? And I had never thought about that before. Like I had my head down and pressing forward to try to make things happen, but never really thought about in the ideal situation what does it even look like. And so I've been working myself trying to challenge myself and trying to imagine that. I'll show this picture because this is at our first repair resource center in Evanston, and it just reminds me of this potential possibilities of a world where we actually have justice. We have environmental justice for everybody, and particularly, racial justice in terms of the environment for those as well. And again, also going beyond the status quo, but looking at not just equality, but also equity. For the times that things were not equal, what are we doing to try to make up for those times? Um, and so we want to think about these things as we move forward in our missions because, injustice, as I say, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And I'd like to share just last closing, I'd like to share briefly about what we're doing in the local community in case those that might be interested in trying to do something themselves. We have a thing called EAR for our Reparations Coalition, Education, Acknowledgement, Reparations. Education is vital. As I mentioned earlier, as someone immersed in this, I'm learning something new all the time. Can't be enough education out there. This is always a major step towards reparations. But then acknowledgement is very key to have acknowledgement. Some people ask me, well, what's the difference between good programming and reparations? And I say, well, part of it is acknowledgement, is identifying the specific harms that were done to African Americans and identifying and acknowledging those harms. Because we know, like, it's one thing to be in pain, that's bad enough. But it's even, worse when people don't acknowledge your pain, right? And so that acknowledgement is a key ingredient in order to get reparations done. And that's what kind of distinguishes it from, good programming. And then the third piece is actually reparations, because without the reparations, it's just talk. And so those are the three components that our local group focuses on. We're trying to educate our community. We'll host events by doing that, by hosting events, doing other things that promote reparations. And a key goal for us, which we actually have some good progress on, is getting our county to have a county-wide reparations commission. I'm on the state commission, for example, and the goal of a commission is to do a harms report to do the research, to do the homework, to find out the different ways that African Americans have been harmed over the years and currently, being able to identify those harms and then come up with recommendations to address those harms, and then work those through various political entities and legislative bodies to start some action towards trying to rectify those harms. In the city of Evanston, for example, they've already paid out over $6 million due to redlining, which happened in cities all across the country. African Americans forced to live in certain parts of town. Those town parts of town are divested in, and next thing you know, there's everything bad you can think of is happening in that part of town. And so in Evanston, if you lived in that area of Evanston where Black people were forced to live in from 1919 to 1969, you became eligible to receive $25,000. They initially started off with doing various things related to your housing, but then they eventually went to cash payments for that as well. And so every community is going to be different. Here in Champaign County, we have what we call restrictive covenants, where it's illegal now, but we actually still have the actual language in 2026 of these parcels of land that still say, in no part thereof will be or sold or leased, either in whole or in part, or to be permitted to be occupied as owned or attended by any person or person not of the Caucasian race. Our county clerk is in the process of trying to identify owners of these different parcels of land, which is 774 parcels of land, where this language still exists, and trying to eradicate that language. I want to show this map. This is Champaign-Urbana's kind of example of redlining. The red dots represent where African Americans are concentrated in Champaign-Urbana. And what I will say is that, besides things like predatory lenders being present in food deserts and those other kind of things, environmentally speaking, Champaign County has a very high rate of prostate cancer among African American men, much higher than white men. It's still a mystery as that's exactly why that's happening, but there's some theory that living on the north end of town might be made tied to it. We don't know, but it is a much higher rate for Black men than it is for white men. Um, and so those are kind of the environmental justice issues that we have to consider and think about, particularly when the effects of redlining may lead to things like that. And for those who don't think reparations could happen, because at one point in time, I admit I was in what they call the hope gap. I wanted reparations to happen, but wasn't too convinced that it could happen. When Evanston happened and they started doing what they're doing, I got convinced. But there's been many other things happening across the country since then. Besides Evanston, you got Ashford, North Carolina, and Shelby County in Tennessee, both having $5 million designated towards reparations reparative work. You also have Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was there where the mayor announced a $105 million private fund that they're raising for reparations there in response to the Tulsa massacre. And then there's California, New York, and Illinois all have state reparations commissions. And I meet in my role with First Repair as regional Midwest regional leader. I meet with Kansas City and Chicago, Detroit, St. Paul, Minnesota, and other Midwest towns that are varying levels of having commissions, which is in their respective areas, which is a joy to experience and see. And so I'll end there and open the floor for some questions, and we'll go from there.
Oh, thank you so much. That was wonderful. We learned a lot. There are some questions here, and I will get right to them. The first one's a hard one, I think. How do we deal with the blowback from the hard right who have sued to stop programs that are specifically set up to help Black and Brown people in financial ways?
Yeah, so there's a lot to that. I would say that Evanston has a lawsuit that I think has pretty much been they had never had any teeth to begin with. And despite the lawsuit, they never stopped dishing out reparations there. They're over $6 million. The key ingredient is identifying the actual harms, because if you actually look at the harms done, it goes back to the example I gave about being locked up in prison falsely. Because if you identify specific harms that are done to people, there's not much of an argument to compensate people for those specific harms. You don't even have to get too deep into race, because the reality is, as I talked to Evanston's attorney, that if you look at the harms, these harms in many cases are only done to African Americans. So if you identify specific harms that are only done to African Americans, you're addressing those harms. There are different approaches to it, but that's one way to avoid any kind of issues there. And I do want to say that it is different than DEI stuff, DEI efforts, because again, it's not just this kind of more of a global approach to trying to right wrongs in this global way is again is being very specific about what's been done, and that's how you get through and past that aspect of it. And we have to often make that distinction between DEI efforts, which again I don't have any problem with in general, but making that distinction between that and reparations. The great question.
Here's another good one from one of our participants. For those that have provided reparations, and there were more examples than I realized, what do you think the biggest hurdle is, or how did those environments overcome the hurdles to create those reparations and get momentum and keep it moving now that it's done? How do they do that?
Yeah, so these commissions that are formed, coalitions, they usually go beyond just like getting the recommendations together and making the proposals. They do more sustaining work. In Evanston, for example, they have two groups. One is the city-based one, and then they actually formed another recent group for the faith-based, because the faith-based community in Evanston raised $1 million for reparations. So they actually just formed a group that's doing the disbursement for that. And so long as you see reparations as a journey and not a destination, and
Mhm.
again, in my opinion, it should be a normative thing. Like I would love to see, for example, we have 380,000 churches in the United States. Let's imagine if 200,000 of them all had reparations in their budgets permanently, like New Covenant has. Imagine if 50,000 of 90,000 municipalities in this country had reparations in their budget permanently. Just the same way you pay your light bill, your water bill, you got a reparations budget line as well. And again, I want us to be able to saturate ourselves with this idea of reparations because you know, enslavement, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, go down the list. All these things were completely integrated, interwoven, saturated in our country. Why wouldn't reparations be as well? Right. And we have 400 years of that. And so let's get at least 400 years of saturation on the other end.
Great answer. Thank you. Um, Here's a question. Tell us more about the First Repair Group that you're working with.
Yeah, First Repair is an organization founded by Robert Ruth Simmons. Robert Ruth Simmons is the person that has been primarily given the credit for getting reparations done in Evanston. She's a former councilwoman, and after she served her term, she decided to dedicate her time to getting reparations done. She managed to identify money in their budget. They got $10 million from marijuana tax sales revenue. They got another $10 million from real estate tax transfer taxes or something like that. Ironically enough, Evanston is a pretty high-end place. They actually have the real estate tax transfers just on $1 million plus homes. But that there's enough $1 million plus homes being sold and bought and sold in Evanston that it gives them another $10 million to work with for their reparations there. And with that said is like, you make it respective and relative to your community, right? I know Champaign-Urbana won't come up with stuff like that, but we could do something. And again, if we do a little something here, a little something there, a little something there, this all can add up. A friend of mine said that a lot of crumbs can make a cake, right? And so if we can kind of build it in many different areas in many different ways, I think we can get to significant changes over time. And they're not just with money, but also with policy changes, awareness, sensitivity to these things. It is, again, there's so much information out there that will, kind of blow your mind when it comes to reparations. You'd be surprised, but once you get there, you really will see how important it is to do this. And I will say with that is reparations is not just for Black folks. When we heal those who are hurting the most, we heal everybody. I honestly believe that our country suffers so much, and we find ourselves in the mess that we find in right now because of our division based on race. If we find a way to come together and heal in that way, I think we heal ourselves in many other ways as well. And reparations is just an example of how we can start that healing process.
Thank you. I have a question for you. Do you know that that racial justice pledge came from Faith in Place? And
Excellent.
and three churches signed it. It wasn't very widely adopted, but New Covenant at a church in Evanston and the Mennonites. So
Excellent. Well,
it's interesting to me that that's a coincidence that both those have resulted in reparations
well,
action.
it
Really
goes to show
cool.
you how action in general makes a difference, right? Because those seeds that you planted literally resulted in all these things that are happening with Champaign for sure, and with many other places and everywhere I go and talk about these things. That seed planted that. So be proud of that faithfulness in that.
I'm very proud of the New Covenant folks. I think that was wonderful. Um, there are some other questions. One of them is about climate reparations, and especially since you brought up the disparities in environmental justice. How can we address those as a community?
Yeah, I think the first thing is being aware. Know that like in many areas, there's disparities between African Americans and other folks, and just being having that information available because when you just kind of generally talk about it, it's like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But when we can add some numbers to it, you could add some stories to it, it becomes much more salient. So first of all, is being knowledgeable about it. Secondly, being creative about, how can we highlight this and provide some more justice to folks. So when we think about policies, maybe we have that disparity in mind as we think about how we change the environment for the better, and that we're thinking about how do we make it more equitable in the process as well. Whatever you're fighting for, always have that lens as to how we resolve it. Because again, if we can find justice for this disproportion of Black folks suffering in these environmental areas, we can find justice for everybody. Because that means we're healing our environment more in general by healing the environment in these areas where African Americans tend to be predominantly located. So yeah, that's one way I kind of think about it.
Do you always start the conversation with the history? Is that how you start a conversation with people that maybe don't want to talk about this? They don't think.
Yeah, that's definitely a starting place. I think one of the key things is relationship. I love the story of Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis, for those who don't know, he's a African American jazz musician. And one day, and this is a TED Talk, so feel free to look this up. One day, he decided he wanted to find out why white people hate him so much. He was 10 years old. Cub Scouts got a rock thrown at him when he was marching to Cub Scouts. So he grew up to be an adult and like, why do white people hate me so much? So he actually decided to meet with the Grand Wizard of the KKK. He set up an appointment at a hotel with him. The KKK member didn't know he was a black guy. So they get together this hotel and it starts off tense, as any conversation we might have might start off tense, but they keep talking. And next thing you know, Daryl Davis is going to his house for dinner. He's going to Daryl Davis' house for dinner. And the TED Talker showed us that Daryl Davis actually goes to Klan rallies with the guy. And the guy's talking, and he's like, I don't trust a lot of you guys out there, but I trust my friend Daryl Davis. And ultimately, Daryl Davis convinces his friend to hang up his rope and denounce the KKK. And before it's all said and done, he did that with over 200 Klan members by forming these relationships with people. And so I'm of the belief that while there are some people who are just outright, survival of the fittest, we have to genocide one people for land, we have to enslave another people for capitalist benefit. That's just life. There are some people that are like that. But I believe the vast, vast majority of people are not like that. They just lack information, they lack knowledge. And so the idea is to form these relationships, get us to care about each other, hear the stories, hear the statistics, hear the history, and you move people along the spectrum. I'm talking to conservative radio stations and other conservative type of groups and heard all kind of crazy questions. I welcome those questions because I get a chance to share that information with the person asking that question. And there's 20, 25 other people with the same question listening to that answer. And you never know what kind of seeds you might plant to end up getting people to move along that spectrum. And so that's kind of how I approach it. You really want to make it a relational thing because again, I don't want reparations to be a one-time, kind of thing and okay, get your money, now go away. It should be a relational thing. It should be an ongoing thing and seeing each other and seeing the injustice and how we need to solve that injustice and those inequities and how we need to address those things over time. So that's kind of how I approach those kind of situations. But again, I'll welcome it. My daughter tells me how, she couldn't do it. Like she hear these questions, she'd lose it. And a lot of people, I understand. I get it. I totally understand why they would. But again, I believe that's where we move the needle. We have to realize that we have much more in common than we don't have in common. When it comes to race, we're talking about way less than 0.1% of our DNA being tied to our skin color. And so if we can just come into grips with that reality, we can move some things. And I can tell you there's people who don't want that to happen. I mean, I'm not just talking about now, I'm talking about throughout history. One of my heroes is Fred Hampton. 21-year-old Black Panther who was all about trying to see justice, fair housing, and breakfast programs, these kind of things. And what he was able to do at the age of 21 is have these rallies where everybody was welcome. There was Latino folks, there was Black folks, there was even white folks. And there's a PBS special, I'll never forget this, and it showed this clip after one of his rallies. And it was this white guy who had a Confederate flag on his jacket. And he said, I got the Black Panthers back and they got mine. It wasn't too long after that that Fred Hampton was shot 168 times while he was sleeping in his home, right? There's people who are opposed to the idea that we are more unique, more united than what really are, that we're more alike than what we realize. If we can figure that part out, all this craziness we deal with now, we don't deal with that kind of craziness, right? And so there's those who don't want to see that unity. We have to fight against that, and we have to promote that unity despite our differences.
Well, I love that. And it's time for us to kind of wrap up the questions. Is there any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with? That was pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks again. I just encourage us to continue to learn. I read recently, a few years ago, that one little nugget, the Statue of Liberty, we all think is for immigration. Well, it turns out that the person who actually had the idea and the design for the Statue of Liberty did so based on the ending of slavery. He was a friend of American abolitionists, and he said that now that slavery is over, America has finally become a true republic. That was inspiration for the Statue of Liberty. And
Mm.
it's evidenced by the fact that the original design for the Statue of Liberty wasn't a tablet in her hand, but there were shackles that are still on the Statue of Liberty today, but they're at her feet. So most people can't even see them, much like in a helicopter, right? And so these is little tiny nuggets of information that exist that we just have no clue about, and they're endless. And so I would encourage us to continue to learn, continue to really absorb the stuff in, and be able to be engaged and get involved. If you want to start something in your community, I'm happy to talk to you and help you get going. It's all about participation and with people and relationships. Our group at Champaign-Urbana, it's like the Rainbow Coalition there. Like we have all kind of folks that are part of this movement. People are surprised that there's majority of our group is older white people fighting for reparations for black folks. And so like you just never know who will be engaged. You don't have to be black to be doing this by any means. Everybody is welcome, and so I would encourage you to think about that, and as you have your movement and everything to throw that into the mix.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your thoughts and the time that you spent sharing with us.
Pleasure.
Friends, we're going to go to breakout rooms now. And so be a little bit patient while the comms team moves you into the breakout room. And let's just give one last round of applause to Dr. Trask. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alrighty, so I opened up the breakout rooms and you should see a little pop-up which you can join. Tonight we're combining Indiana and Wisconsin. If you're not assigned to a breakout room, you can either maybe drop the number in the chat of the room that you want to join, and I'll be assigning. One. Bob, Barbara, Jacqueline, Tolly, is there a room that you want to join?
I think one, please.
What was that, Barbara?
Yes. I don't know how to,
Alrighty.
I don't know how to work this.
Okay, I've got you. Is it Yvonne? Is there a number that you want to join? or a room that you want to join?
No, I thought I'd join the Wisconsin, Illinois.
Wisconsin. Alrighty. Kimberly, are you able to see the pop-up for joining Illinois? Jacqueline, Tolly.
Hey, sorry about that, y'all.
Hi, Grace. Do you want to join Indiana again?
Illinois, yes.
Illinois? Yes, Illinois. Let me get the papers. You said Illinois, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. Jacqueline, is there a room that you want to join? Or Tolly, Bob? Billy Cody, got it. There we go. I think we're good.
You want to stop the live stream?
Yes. Okay.